Backwards Moon, Chapter 21. Come with us, she cried to Dee and Anna. Try! Dee pushed her hand against the door, against the blackness, but her palm stopped in midair as though there was no door, only solid tree trunk. I can see the door, she said quietly, but it's no use. We'll never be witches again. Go, now, hurry! Do you know who we are? Blurted Nettle. Dee's expression softened. Oh, my dear, she said. We do, at last, said Anna. And no matter how it hurts, I'm glad we remembered everything, and we're sorry about what happened. It's hard that we were gone so long, said Dee gently. I wish things had been different. But know this, even if we'd had magic enough, we wouldn't have gone through the door without you. We would never go and leave you behind. You know that, don't you? Yes, said Nettle. But now you must go through it without us. Go, cried Dee. Hurry! Nettle let her spark. But I have so many questions. I'll only say a little. We can't risk it, said Dee. The fading is not to be trifled with. Go now. Light your spark. Please. We love you, said Anna. Tell Bracken we loved you both. We always did, even when we had forgotten who you were, said Dee, and we always will. It was not something a witch would ever say out loud, but it meant everything. Oh, said Nettle. Go, said Dee. Gently, she pushed Nettle through. Nettle felt cool, damp sand beneath her feet. Bracken stood beside her, trembling. They looked back through the door, and for an instant they saw the tiny figures of Dee and Anna in the garden behind them. Then Dee and Anna flickered and vanished, along with all of the human world. Wait, moaned Nettle, but there was no going back. What happened? Said Rose. Nettle stood for a moment, dazed. Oh, she said, not knowing what to say. Nothing. Everything. I can tell you later. Are you all right? It's all right, Rose, said Nettle. It wasn't really. Not then, and not ever. But sometimes there is nothing for it but to go on. Finger sparks shone. Rose, Scabiosa, Aunt Iris, Sedge, and Reed stood around her. The light flickered on the earthen walls of a tunnel. It was wide and sloped gently upward. A sound washed over them, a distant roaring that rose and fell like the sound of someone breathing. At the end of the tunnel shone a circle of sky, brighter around the edges. They put out their sparks and walked quietly toward it. They stepped outside. A vast blue opened all around them. Waves crested and broke in white foam. Little long-legged seabirds skittered across the shining sand, probing it with their slender beaks. The ocean, said Bracken softly. I've always wanted to see the ocean. The little birds stopped their probing and circled them on quickly moving legs. Welcome, said one. We're witches, said Nettle. We know that, said the first. We're sandpipers. Pleased to meet you. Well, that's settled. Let's go, said one, and the sandpipers skittered toward the waves. Wait, said Bracken. Are there other witches here? And woodfolk? Are there woodfolk? Both, said the last of the sandpipers. Their feet left tracks like stitching in the sand. The waves curled and broke, and wind blew off the ocean. When Nettle and Bracken turned their backs to the water, they saw wind-blown, gray-green pines with bare branches like driftwood, high atop pale cliffs that rose from the sand. Beyond the cliffs stood a forest of trees so tall their pointed tops seemed lost in mist. Did you hear what they said? Witches and woodfolk. I like this place, said Nettle, and Bracken nodded. I like it too. In the days that followed, the 7 witches built their new village. It took much magic and arguing, but when it was done, the cottages stood high on a cliff top, all in a line. Nettle and Bracken's sleeping loft looked out over the ocean. Every morning, the 2 of them went exploring. They flew low over coves where sea lions arced from the rocks. Seals swam through a forest of seaweed that swayed in the aqua water. Sea otters floated on their backs, holding rocks between their front paws, breaking shellfish. The air was filled with the cries of hundreds and hundreds of seabirds nesting on the cliffs. One day, as they flew over a sweeping half-moon of sand, they saw a path winding up the cliff and into the forest. They landed on the cliff top and followed the path into the woods. The trees had soft, red trunks. They were so gigantic that when you walked among them, you could see the sunlight on the very tops of the trees and blue patches of sky, but down by the forest floor it was dim, and the air was cool and spicy smelling. Nettle stopped and pointed. A fire, she said. They hurried forward. It was a very small fire at the base of a particularly large tree. Beside it sat a man. He held a penknife in one nimble hand, a stick of wood in the other. Wood chips flew around him. Nettle and Bracken walked closer, and the woodfolk man looked up. "Well now," he said, "merry meet and merry part." It was hard to tell if he was young or old. "Are you from the Caircross tribe?" asked Bracken, for that was their father's tribe. "I'm not," he said, "but I can show you where the gathering camp is." He stood up and slipped his knife into the pocket of his gray-green raggedy trousers. He glanced at the fire and it went out, leaving not even a burned spot on the forest floor. "Nobody's there now, but all the tribes will be back at midwinter," he said as they set off. He led them past streams and over hills, striding through the greenish light with a long, loping gait. "Seems to me a tribe of that name came here years ago, through one of the lesser passage trees. Tricky things, those. Lots of people are fooled by them." Traveling by a lesser passage tree, the woodfolk man explained, was a risky venture. You might think it was an ordinary passage tree, the kind that woodfolk often took to get from place to place, but once you step through, you're in another world, and there's no going back. Bracken looked at Nettle. "So that's what happened," she said quietly. They knew now for certain their fathers hadn't left them on purpose. A weight lifted and was gone. By now there was no path that Nettle could see, but the woodfolk man loped on, sometimes resting one big hand against a tree, as though it were a particular friend. "As old as rocks, these trees are," he said as they walked. "You've come to a good place." At last he stopped. "There it is," he said, pointing down a slope, that little flat place. There was no sign of trampled grass or chopped trees or of left-behind tent pegs lying around, but with woodfolk there never was. Bracken made a silver spell mark and left it shimmering on a tree where she could find it again, and where the woodfolk would see it when they returned. Then there was nothing more to do but wait. "How many moons until midwinter here?" asked Nettle. "3," said the woodfolk man. Bracken said it wasn't so long, really. Every night Nettle and Bracken watched the moon out of their sleeping loft window. It was Nettle who noticed that the moon here was different. Here the new moon's crescent of pale silver faced the same way as the rim of her right thumbnail, and surely in the valley the new moon had faced the other way. Nettle showed Bracken with her thumbnail. "The moon goes backwards here. It's a backwards moon." Said Bracken, looking up at it. "I think you're right." "I wonder what Ben and the others are doing right now," Bracken said. Nettle wondered about Elizabeth too, but there was no way of telling. "Maybe when the woodfolk come, they'll know where some other witches are," she said. "One's our age, even." Bracken nodded. "Maybe they will. You know, tomorrow we could go find some ravens. We could play the raven game. If they don't already know it, we could teach them." "Maybe there are marmots here," said Bracken. "Or we could try talking to some of the sea lions, maybe." "Otters," said Nettle. "I think otters would be way more interesting than sea lions." They were still arguing when they went to bed, but it didn't matter really. They had lots of days ahead of them, and tomorrow would be a fine one for flying.